Okay, so this is going to be a quick tutorial on how to do a microscope PM. First and foremost, it's just good to have the right attitude about the PM. So when I first went out into the field, I had taken all the knowledge from being in the office and seeing QC on microscopes throughout the years. And so when I go to a microscope PM, as opposed to just looking at it as like a function test and cleaning, I'm looking at it as I'm trying to get this microscope to a stage where it's to spec, as if it left our office and came out to the customer. Now, of course, you can't deal with any of the paint and things of that nature, but in terms of the functionality of the microscope, we want to kind of bring that microscope up to original spec. So being as meticulous as possible and as consistent as possible is really important. It's very easy to kind of fall into this place of just cleaning and kind of getting done with the PM and moving on to the next thing. But I'm going to start from the bottom and work my way up, which is typically how I always do a PM, and I do the optics last, so we'll cover that at the very end. The first thing to do is to come up with a standard, which I'm going to go over certain standards, and you stick to that standard. The main point of this is we're trying to train the customer on what the expectations are every single time you come out for a PM. So when you come out for an annual PM, there's going to be certain expectations that you're going to set, and that customer is going to get used to expecting the same sort of terminology coming to them and the same sort of replacements on a yearly basis. So first, we're going to start at the base. I test the floor brake, and we're looking at an OH6, Leica OH6. Everything that I'm going to show you on this stand is going to be pretty consistent with the Leica OH4, 5, and 6. The Arveo and the OHX are a little bit different, but similar. So you can take all of this onto other Leica OH microscopes. But in addition to that, a lot of these things are going to be able to translate into every microscope, whether it's Zeiss, Leica, or all the other microscope manufacturers. So first and foremost, we just test the brake. On the Leica OH stands, it should be effortless. You should be able to push that down and it holds. And then releasing, so this release is actually kind of sticky. It's sticky because it's going through a refurbish process right now. But if for some reason you're out there, and two things could happen with this brake. If it's sticky to release like that, or when you go to press it down, it jumps back up or it never quite holds, the brake ratchet plate on this system needs to get replaced. So there's a ratchet plate in there. Over time it gets worn. When it's worn, you just replace it. It's a quick replacement. That replacement is $1,200. So if we're taking standard PM where you're just going out and you're just cleaning, doing function tests, and you really don't have any parts attached to it, you're looking at $145 and then $195 for travel, depending on what your travel is. In this instance, if the brake is not working, I would test it a couple times, maybe 3 or 4 times. If it consistently doesn't work, then I immediately add that to the line items of the service report. So this is another part of training your customer. You want to have active language in your service report, so no passive language. So if I see a failure on the microscope, I'm never saying I suggest or maybe or might. If I see a failure, like in this instance, I say the brake ratchet plate has failed. It inconsistently holds the floor stand in place. The brake ratchet plate needs to be replaced. See below for pricing. And then immediately I add the pricing and that part to the line items of the service report. So that gets totaled into the final pricing of the PM. I do that for a couple reasons. You have to assume the sale, so that's the first thing. And you have to train the customer to understand that any sort of failure during the PM, it's a requirement for them to get it up to speed, back up to spec. So in this instance, this floor brake would not be working. That $1,200 line item would land on the service report and get added on. So now we're at $145, $195, and then the $1,200. So just to get this through, get that released. So floor brake, brake ratchet plate. Then I check the casters. So on the Leica OH stands, and this is a good rule of thumb for any microscope, you should trust that the casters are going to work. So if you go rolling the stand and it's kind of hard, or you're having to really struggle to maneuver the stand, you have to trust the fact that those casters, there's a problem with them. It should be relatively effortless. I moved this microscope stand here and it was effortless. But in instances where it's kind of tough for you to move it, those casters typically do need to get addressed. It's a little bit more clear cut on the older stands, say the Leica H bases, the old S5s, S3s. What I'll do in that instance is I'll actually get on the ground and I'll look at the tread of that caster. So the tread of the caster is either going to be a hard plastic or a rubber. If you start seeing surface cracks or surface wear, I immediately replace them. And same deal. The language in that PM then becomes casters have wear on the tread, cracks, dry cracking, and need to be replaced, see below for pricing. And then it gets added to the line items. In this instance, the casters are okay. You won't ever see dry cracking or wear on these larger casters, but what will happen is the bearings start to run really rough. It has a hard time maneuvering around. So that's on these larger casters. Another thing that can happen is you'll get flats on the wheels, and that typically happens if the stand sits in one location for a long period of time. The weight of these stands is immense. So over time, you've been in ORs where sometimes they just leave the stand right there in the OR, and then they maybe move it 3 or 4 feet, and then back and forth, right? Over time, you'll start to get flats, and it'll just be a bumpy ride. Same deal. As soon as I feel that bumpiness to the casters, I replace it. So moving up, the next stage of this is dust that accumulates in this unit because the electronics are actually in here, the light source is in here, it draws a lot of dust in. So this back plate here is one that I always address on Leica OH stands. This one is actually in pretty good shape. So there's 6 screws that hold this plate on, and then you pop this off. When you pop this off, there's a cavity. There's a couple power supplies in there, and the electronic brake for the pivot point here. This one actually looks pretty good, but typically when I open this up, it is caked with dust. So it's really important to get that cleared out, because this cavity is connected to the light source cavity. So if there's lots of dust in here, what's going to happen is you're going to get dust accumulation on the inside of the light source, and it's going to affect the light output of the light source. So really key to blow that out. Sometimes I'll even take a Q-tip and I'll go in between, of course, when the microscope is off, and I'll clear out in between the little heat sinks of the power supply, make sure that all the dust that is accumulated in there is taken out. And then when that's done, I replace this plate. If the dust is really bad, what I'll do is I'll check so I'm going to check this cavity here. Before I have this microscope turned on, I will typically, around this time, I will open this light source up, and then I'm going to take this panel off. Once again, this is only consistent with the Leica OH stands. So this is where the filter wheel is at, and the assembly for the bulb changer. There is a mirror, there's 2 mirrors in there. So when we change that lamp, one of these mirrors comes engaged. So you got a mirror down here, a heat filter, another mirror, and then a series of filters here for the filter wheel. I had a situation where I had the Leica Luxmeter kit, and I was having some discrepancies with the light output. And these looked clean, but I went in there and I cleaned that off, cleaned just the residue that had accumulated and just a little bit of dust layer that had accumulated, and there was a 30% increase in light output. So this has become one of the things that I do during the PM. So if